just before we do, I wanted firstly to welcome people who haven't been to Radix Big Tent events before. Radix Big Tent is a messy name for our think tank, but it's the result of the merger between Radix UK and Big Tent, both organisations which were interested in providing a platform for those outside the political mainstream to influence and discuss political events. And we call ourselves the think tank of system change, the system change think tank, and we try to provide these sorts of discussions on a regular basis. Before we kick off, I just wanted to pay tribute to our first policy director who helped set Radix up in 2016, David Boyle, who sadly passed away last week. A number of you will know him, and indeed, if you're in the think tank world, it's quite rare to come across people who haven't collaborated with him. One of the sort of really great brains of our generation, really original thinker and really good at spotting what was coming down the line. I was reading, by way of reminder, his book about alternative currencies, alternative money systems from the mid-90s, and thinking, this is all written before the internet, or at least before the internet's widely spread, let alone cryptocurrencies or anything like that. So a guy with great insight, but who wrote about absolutely everything, including many histories and historical novels about explorers who discovered America and sailed around the world. So please, I hope you'll take the time to look up David Boyle and maybe even check out some of his books. With that, we'll get into tonight's discussion, and it's going to be chaired, as so often, by our chair of fellows, Vicky Pryce. Needs no introduction other than to say one of the country's most eminent economists, but much more important than that in this case, as I say, the chair of Radix Fellows, and who will take us through tonight's discussion. If you enjoy it, I will tell you more about our next discussion at the end. Please do come back. But for now, with the request that if you aren't one of the speakers, to mute and turn off your videos just for this first half of the discussion, I hand over to Vicky.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben, and really great to see so many turning up and some new faces, as I was saying, and as Ben was saying. And it's great to welcome David Peretz and Professor Andrew Lambert to this. Now, I have to confess that I've known David for quite some time, even before, I would guess, he joined the civil service, but he has had a very great career wandering around the world, in fact, with various cabinet ministers and also defining UK policy. And I think that's pretty good. A long time, of course, at the Treasury. And I've known him personally in any case. And I was delighted to have been invited to go to the launch of his book, which is called Sailing for the Empire, Slavery, Piracy and Trade. And I think that's quite relevant to what we're going to be talking about. Perhaps the piracy, not quite so much, or perhaps even the slavery, but certainly the trade. And here is a copy of the book that I'm holding. It's quite a substantial volume, beautifully well done with illustrations in it. He'll tell us a little bit more about it. And Professor Andrew Lambert happened to also be at the launch of the book and made such an important contribution to the proceedings when David was talking about his book, that I thought perhaps we should have him as well to this event to talk to us a little bit about the sort of history. And the reason why I was fascinated about this is that it does highlight the importance. I mean, I hadn't quite understood much about the British Navy, and do bear in mind that I'm Greek, and of course the Greeks have used the water for thousands of years, and of course even now in terms of trade they dominate quite a lot of the shipping lines. So what's going on right now is particularly important, but it really was the fact that the Navy, of course, was so involved in facilitating some of that trade, and particularly between the UK and China. And I think that was, and the rest of the world. And that for me was quite an important reason why perhaps, given everything else happening right now, we should think about that a little bit more and see what lessons we can learn in terms of the relationship, particularly between the UK and China, but also what it says for the future relationship that we may have, given everything that's going on. And we're meeting this evening at a time when there are all these concerns about the Middle East. Things have, of course, intensified with what is happening between Iran and Israel, but also the American involvement. Talks about closing the Strait of Hormuz and what that may mean for trade. Everyone worried already about oil prices and inflation and recession and everything else that comes with it. It just shows how interconnected we all are. And of course, there's been so much going on over the last few months and perhaps sort of years in terms of the polarization of trade and relationships that exist across the world, that for me, it was absolutely the right time to try and look at this again from a historical perspective and see what lessons we can learn and if it tells us anything about the future. So with that, I thought, David, maybe you can talk a little bit about the book and then bring it up to date if you like. And then maybe sort of Andrew can say a few words as well. If we could keep it to about sort of 7 minutes or 10 minutes or so for David, and maybe another 5 or so from Andrew, and then we'll open it up. And I'll ask a few questions, interactive as it always does. And people with expertise can have their own views on things, particularly as they perhaps relate to today and hopefully to tomorrow. There are already some questions that have been asked. You'll see them in the chat, and I'll try and weave them into the questions that I ask of David and Andrew. And please do participate, all of you. So, David, over to you.
Okay, well, I'll start off. I hope those of you who've either bought the book or borrowed a copy enjoyed it. That it looks so good, as Vicky says, and reads so well is mainly a tribute to John Corbett, who wrote the letters and drew the pictures. But it also tells an interesting life story and gives an exceptional insight into the social life of the mid-Victorian Navy. But what does it tell us about Britain's place in the world? So much of how we are seen as a nation is coloured by the legacy of our 19th century empire and period of global naval dominance, not least in China, where Chinese leadership still speak about years of humiliation by colonial powers. So I think one question this history put in my mind is our record something to be proud of or something to be ashamed of? And then I'll come on to the question, what else does history have to tell us about British-Chinese relationships? But on the first question, gives me the answer, well, a bit of both. In terms, helping put an end to the slave trade is clearly a plus. Deterring really nasty pirates in Borneo, who were also slave traders, is a plus. Opening up China to import diamonds. If you go through John Corbett's career in more detail, of in Lebanon supporting the Ottoman Empire against Muhammad Ali, who was pretty, but certainly from his account, the British forces got a lot of support from the local population who really didn't want to be ruled by Muhammad Ali. Year of action against the slave trade speaks for itself. But even in China, there are pluses as well as minuses. The Qing dynasty might easily have succumbed to the really nasty Taiping rebels, and it was quite a close run thing. That was a cult who, for example, believed that anybody of Manchu descent was a devil and should be killed on sight, and indeed they were killed on sight. And without the help from the British Navy and Colonel Gordon, later General Gordon of Khartoum, I think the Queen indeed and sort of imperial power in retrospect. Its impact on Japan led to that country's industrialization and military might, with both good and bad.
Sorry, David. Can you explain the Richardson murder?
Oh, Richardson, he was a British person traveling in Japan who was attacked by the retinue of a Japanese leader, and actually, because he refused to get out of the way, and was chopped down and died. And several of his party were badly wounded at the same time. And the British government said they wanted reparations, and they wanted the people responsible tried and hung. In the end, they got reparations. They sent a naval force to bombard the Japanese city that was made. And the immediate result was that the Japanese wanted to have lessons from the British Navy about how to do it.
I see.
Which they did. And they then took lessons from the Germans about how to run an army, and were pretty successful.
Right. So there are unintended consequences, or perhaps...
There are unintended consequences of all sorts of things. And I think the letters show one other thing, that at least some of those responsible for policing the empire were open-minded, humane, unprejudiced, and treated those they met in other lands with respect and generosity. But the letters also show how much of the British naval effort at the time was devoted to promoting open markets and free trade. In the case of opium, perhaps not such a good thing, but in broader terms, that was a development of immense benefit to not just to China, but to all Asian countries. So
all this was taken from letters that, I mean, just to explain in terms of the background of the book.
Yeah.
That you've then interpreted it into, I mean, you've got some of the letters, and then you've also explaining what the background around them was. That's basically what you have a lot of in the book.
Yeah.
Which is obviously historical as well.
And so on the other question posed by today's event, what does history tell us about UK-China relations now and in the future? I don't have a great deal to say, but I mean, one thing is perhaps expect a certain amount of duplicity and perfidy. At least that's what history told us. During Corbett's time in China, the Chinese signed a treaty that they had very little intention of honoring. They kidnapped and took hostage a delegation which was on its way to sign another treaty, and in fact tortured and in fact killed some of them. So modern equivalents, I suppose, would include theft of intellectual property, industrial spying, misuse of the internet. But even on the British side, there was a certain amount of duplicity, because the event which was said to have started the Second Opium War, the arrest of seamen from a supposedly British-flagged ship, was a pretty doubtful pretext, in fact. And the other thing I would say is expect unforeseen consequences. I mean, after all, in the long term, which country has benefited most from the 19th century British effort to open up China to global trade? Was it Britain or was it China?
Right.
That's what I have to say to start with.
Indeed. So you're basically benefactors in the sense of having allowed China or given it the tools maybe to to imitate what we did or what the Brits did, possibly, or get the best out of it. Is that how you see it? And then
they did pretty well from open trade in the end.
Yeah. So open trade has been the thing, and of course, I mean the Navy has been quite involved in ensuring that trade stayed open. And so maybe if we now move to perhaps Andrew to say a few words about this. Andrew?
Yes, I think the great thing about David's book, and indeed the work of John Corbett, is to highlight in detail how what we often think of as a rather diffuse issue is resolved. It's about technological asymmetry. The Royal Navy is able to operate very effectively in the Chinese coastal and riverine environment because of new technology. Even in the first Anglo-Chinese War in the 1840s, the British are using iron steamboats. China hasn't seen steam engines or iron ships. And so these things are really very progressive. And what they do is they change the balance of power between a small maritime empire operating from London and a very large continental empire operating out of Beijing. Beijing, of course, is a long way from the sea, and people living in Beijing, particularly the emperor, and barbarians are coming across the sea in ships. This has happened for hundreds of years. But these barbarians in the 1840s are able to sail up the Yangtze River and take command of the Grand Canal, which is the system used to supply Beijing with rice. And the British know this because they've been in China long enough to do some reconnaissance and to make some notes. In the 1880s, 1780s, Lord Macartney takes a mission all the way to Beijing. And on the way back, they travel from Beijing down the Grand Canal to the Yangtze River. And all the while, they're taking notes and making soundings. They work out that this is indeed the weak point of the entire Chinese empire. The grain supply to Beijing is critical. A mission by Lord Amherst in 1816 has the same result. The Chinese are not interested in increasing trade with Britain at a time when the global economy is starting to suffer from China hoarding large amounts of silver, which have arrived in the country. And the Amherst mission ends up doing very much the same thing. So when the first Anglo-China War breaks out, the Admiralty Secretary, a very important figure, had actually been on the Macartney mission and had written the official report. And one of the officers from the Amherst mission backed him up with exactly the same argument. Using agile maritime progressive assets, it was possible for a small country on the other side of the world to operate very effectively. What the British are after, as David has said, is more trade. It's part of the way in which Britain is dealing with its big problem in the 19th century, which is an immense debt burden incurred fighting against Napoleon. And this is why the Liberal government is not very liberal with the use of force against China, because this is the world's biggest market and it's closed. So it's about opening up markets, it's freeing trade with a degree of force, and it leads to what we know as the unequal treaties. China is obliged to sign up to some things it doesn't really want to sign up to. But of course, those unequal treaties are not just with Britain, they're with several other countries. The biggest unequal treaty is with Russia. And that territorial seizure is still unresolved. The Russians still hold the territory they took from China in the mid-1850s. And when you ask Chinese officials about when they're going to ask for their territory back, the answer is usually not yet, which I suggest is a classic way of dealing with this. So we're looking at a period in which Britain, for all its small scale and distance, has critical advantage. It has the technological edge. Now, of course, we're looking at China, which probably does have some technological edge of its own. But China remains, and indeed the 20th, 21st century have made it much more dependent on the globalized world. China was able to think about itself as freestanding and relatively independent of the world. But now its dependence on things, particularly like hydrocarbons from the Middle East and raw material imports, mean that it's been drawn out of that position and is now engaged much more widely. So yes, closure of the Straits of Hormuz would be an issue. It's not the only source of oil for China, but it is a significant one. And given the current state of the Russian oil market, it's not entirely obvious where extra supplies would come from. So this won't be an opium war. If there's conflict in the near future, it might be an oil war. It might be about the regime at the Straits of Hormuz. Because if Western powers are blockading Iran, I won't name it, interfere with the trade going out to other countries, be some support there. I'm sure the current Chinese government would not like to see the government around and probably feel that the events of this last week are disadvantageous to their interests. So I think we can be prepared for some more interesting times. The question is anybody going to make the first move, or are we going to see an endless supply of threats to invade Taiwan, which is probably not the main issue, or is something actually going to happen?
Well, what do you mean it's not the main issue? Because of course there have been some questions here. I mean, for President Trump, there may be or may not be. For the rest of us, in terms of showing where China wants to go next.
Taiwan is a very easy for China to talk about in terms of establishing the security of its territorial waters, which are extended quite a long way out. And taking back Taiwan would extend that territorial sea area, and in that sense would be advantageous. The purpose, of course, is to limit the amount of pressure that can be put on China by a blockade by Western powers. So it's a legal question. What is the international law on that? How far would China be able to resist that kind of blockade? And taking Taiwan will be advantageous. But it also is a legacy issue for the regime, which goes back a very long way. It's quite hard to get rid of these commitments. You've promised to do something, and generation after generation, it doesn't happen. It begins to eat away at the credibility of what is, after all, a radically autocratic regime in which even the limited transfer of power under the communist system has been overtaken by the current leader of the state. So we've seen China go back towards an imperial autocratic model. The only question we have to ask is who will take over when Xi Jinping is finished.
But I think there are two interesting questions there. I mean, first of all, will they? Are you implying that they're almost forced to take Taiwan because it's expected of them? And second, if they do and succeed in this, what? And because you did say, if this is just a sideshow in a way, what are the other? I mean, apart from ensuring there is no blockade in the future that way, what are the other, in your view, intentions of China?
Well, 19th century wars and the 21st century standoff economics.
Right. Well, it's the economy stupid after all. Yes. Okay.
That's what they're about. The Chinese are facing a different Western economic superpower with different attitudes to the use of force. So I think we have to take that on board. The Americans are much hastier in their resort to arms than the British were in the 19th century and would be today. So the prize is to be the global hegemon. The prize is to be the leader of the world, dropping out the free thing, which I don't think applies anymore. And the economic benefits from that would be enormous for whichever of those two powers was to achieve that status. So therefore, that is the risk point. I don't see Taiwan as the risk point. Taiwan would be collateral to that. But the difficulties of a large-scale amphibious operation of the size needed to capture Taiwan in the face of very well-prepared defenses and modern weapon systems, the casualties would be horrific. Unless the Chinese resorted to the use of tactical nuclear weapons, their losses would be enormous. And I'm not sure that the regime is willing to face the political fallout from the loss of 100,000 men.
So in that case, you don't think that it's imminent? Because again, going back to the question in the chat. No.
I think it's one of those things you talk about every week because
so you carry on talking about it, but not do it, basically.
Absolutely. It's been going on too long for anything else.
But okay, so there are. I mean, it's very interesting, David and Andrew. I mean, the questions in the chat, and we will open it up pretty soon. Also, sort of, focus a little bit on what does this then mean for the UK. I mean, we are perhaps right now a bit of an insignificant power. Outside the EU, small, sort of being nice to Trump just to get a little bit of a trade agreement of sorts. And then, of course, he does something in Iran without telling anyone, supposedly. So are they, and there's been this whole big question of should we be, in fact, sort of closer to Europe rather than the US, who is more reliable, unreliable? But isn't the real question, should we be closer to China rather than the US? Particularly given everything that's going on right now. I wouldn't mind the views of both Andrew and David on this. So since I've got Andrew on my screen for some reason, first, Andrew.
Oh, well, I'm happy to do that. I think Britain needs to do what it's always done, which is to balance off the advantages of various partnerships. Now, we have to remember that we spent a lot of time in the 19th century arguing with the Americans about their tariff programs. And funnily enough, we're still arguing with the Americans about their tariff programs because their world view and their economic views are fundamentally different. They are a continental scaled economy, which can well afford to ignore wider pressure from the rest of the world in ways that Britain hasn't been able to do for at least 300 years. So the Americans are not natural partners any more than China is a natural partner. They're both very different economies. And the end result is you tend to forget, if you're leading Britain in these discussions, that you are operating in a global maritime medium-sized power, and that your vital interests are not the same as the superpowers of the contemporary world. Your interests are in free trade, they're in moving goods and services, they're in keeping open supply lines. And these are not the primary interests of the Americans or the Chinese.
That's interesting. But of course, you did talk about intellectual property, and I think, David, you touched on that as well. So the way that the Chinese are doing it, David, is very much by either imitating technology or leapfrogging in some areas, but not all of them. And they do have, thinking again about trade and what they can sell, all those rare earth minerals that seem to now, because of the move to net zero or more green and so on, to be, the thing that everyone wants. So does that remind us of what was happening over the period covered in the book, and any lessons we can learn from that?
I mean, yeah, the rare earths thing is quite interesting, Vicky, because I think it's helped bring home to the Americans how interconnected they actually are. Maybe in due course they will be mining their own rare earths, but for several years to come, they're reliant on China. And so in a way, I think Andrew is right that these are two superpowers, both of which don't have that much, both of which could be self-sufficient, but the answer is they can't be self-sufficient, at least not quickly, not even the US. So I wonder, and that, I mean, the British, as Andrew and you say, has always been to keep open trade, to have markets where we can buy things and sell things. And maybe we can still do that, even with these two competing superpowers looking for dominance.
Well, it's interesting because one of the questions is, do we have to choose? I mean, the thing that I mentioned, is it going to be China's turn now to take? I mean, they're a bigger country in terms of the numbers of people. The forecasts are still that it's going to take them some time before their GDP per head, of course, increases to the level that we have in the US. So it's going. So they're not quite there yet, of course, and they won't be for a while. But in terms of therefore, though, as they're moving towards being, quite a superpower, does this affect the way in which we should be looking at them and developing our own relationships with them? Because of course there are all these, for example, we have just signed supposedly a trade deal with the US, which seems to be saying, because we haven't seen the details necessarily, that we're not going to get the concessions on the exports to the US tariff-free for steel and aluminium unless we make sure we don't, in fact, bring in any Chinese or any of the other countries that they're worried about material in, which we then, of course, melt and produce the steel that we use for our own use here and sometimes export to the US. So there is a real conflict going on right now in terms of how far can we move towards China, given all those problems. And then, of course, we've seen that in the telecoms area with Huawei. We've seen it, of course, in terms of Chinese companies not being allowed to invest in various parts of industry. We've seen that in the EU, where they're tightening up, even though there is a lot of contradiction what their policies are doing. They go and talk to the Chinese, encouraging some investment. And then, of course, they have strategic industries where they don't allow that investment to happen. So we are in a position, I think, right now where there is huge amount of schizophrenia, really, in terms of how we deal with China. Do you see that from the previous experience that the UK has had with China as at any stage? I mean, Andrew was saying it's all to do with economics as far as China. They are facing those issues, those restrictions. Suddenly, the Europeans have put 45% tariffs on EVs from China, whereas it was 0 before. Admittedly, in the US, it's 100% for electric vehicles. So where do you see this thing perhaps, moving towards being resolved, or is this something we have to live with, and this insecurity, uncertainty would be with us for quite some time to come? David first.
I don't know. Just thinking back to back in the late 90s, in the Treasury, I was responsible for, I think, something, if I remember rightly, called the UK-Chinese economic relationship. We had meetings twice a year, and I must say they were extremely good, and the Chinese officials needs to be held in 6 months after the Chinese takeover. So it involved both countries cooperating, which we did. And but I don't. How much things have changed since then on the Chinese side? I don't know.
Which they have, because of course, as you know, an MP trying to get to Hong Kong to see her son was sort of sent straight back because of sitting on some committee here in the UK, parliamentary committee. Similar to the one that you're referring to, that officials were servicing, if you like, back in the 90s, and she wasn't allowed to stay or was sent straight back. So yes, things have changed, and of course, the regime has changed. Well, has toughened up, as I think you were suggesting before. So we are talking about a slightly different China. So it would be interesting to see what others also think. And Andrew, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think this very fluid situation is a permanent factor. If you look at the 19th century, the rare earth mineral is silver. Silver lubricates the global economy. With the collapse of the Spanish Empire in the New World, the supply of silver through the Philippines to China is drying up. China is holding large amounts of silver, and that is beginning to compromise the fluidity of the global economy. And one of the things the British are trying to do is to find ways of getting that silver back into circulation to increase their revenues, because they are facing this economic pressure on the basis of the scale of the national debt. I think it's also worth remembering that there have been periods of very close cooperation. So in the early 20th century, down towards the end of the Second World War, Britain and China are cooperating in the Far East against Japan. And a lot of Chinese development, certainly in their navy in the 1920s, 30s, is very much linked into the Royal Navy. They're looking for support there. And that goes down right to the end of the Second World War. So we look, and some of the founders of the current Chinese Navy trace their origins back to those British naval missions, much as the Japanese Navy did. So there have been periods of very close cooperation, but they tend to be when there's mutual need rather than a sense that one country is more powerful and has advantages over the other. So there are periods in which there have been dominance by one side or the other, and periods of partnership. And I suspect that this will be the case in the future.
Yes.
It will be fluid. To patrol that might reduce the possibility of the current Iranian regime firing missiles at tankers, because those tankers might well be carrying Chinese cargoes. So, and we saw Chinese cooperation with the Somali pirate issue. So there are issues on which you cooperate and you build on those. And David has far more experience of that than most people. You know, it is about exploiting opportunities to build relationships, and sometimes that pays off, sometimes it doesn't. But it's a constant factor in building up the possibility that you will have somebody to talk to who understands who you are and what you're doing and is prepared to negotiate. And that's, I think, the best we can hope to achieve, short of fairly fundamental change either in China or in the West.
Thank you very much. There is a question about what China could do, Rita. I'll get maybe Julia and Ranger to ask that question themselves. But I did want to ask one other thing, because of course we're talking about two big regions of the world. Well, one is, you know, both big countries, the US and China, which could in theory be self-sufficient, but of course they do also depend a lot on trade. I mean, remembering of course that if you look across the world, we think that they're really, really important, but in terms of trade, they do, if I'm not mistaken, account for about sort of 14% each. So there's a lot of other trade that goes on. And of course, India is now becoming important, and a lot of the EU is very important as well. But of course, everything that goes on the oil front, which comes from the Middle East. So there are loads and loads of countries which take part in trade, and they will all be interested in this and seeing that things go smoothly. It's not just them, but what we've also got is the EU trying to get itself a position with all the conflicts going on right now as the place to be, to invest in, more competitive if they could become that. But on the rare earth side, they're spending a lot of money investing. There are countries in Europe that do have particular rare earth minerals, and the EU is putting money into individual countries, choosing which ones to prioritize in each case, so there is no huge amount of duplication. So there seems to be some move to try and reduce some of China's importance in this. So I think that will be interesting in terms of the balance. It will take some time, of course.
Yeah.
But I think for the moment we're seeing that there is a little bit of an attempt to reduce that supremacy of China. Do you want to come in, David?
No, yeah. I believe that even in Cornwall there is possibility of rare earths mining, but to open the mines and even more the processing facilities will take 4 or 5 years. So
true,
it's not going to happen quickly.
Okay, so we have some questions, and I wonder whether people would like to ask them. So is Julian Ranger there? Can you? Everyone? Oh, great.
Hello there.
Great, Julian. It's good. Please ask your question about Taiwan.
Is South China in Taiwan so often blockade of the South China Sea with their navy not be a significant step? Because it would be very hard to counter, because you can't shoot first, and they could easily then sort of, for a period, control the flow of ships and things through the South China Sea, and therefore state their dominance in the area that way and really dare the West and everybody else, if you like, to try and stop them. So does that seem more likely or less likely than invading Taiwan? Although they always talk about invading Taiwan, as you said, maybe not doing it.
Yes. Happy to make a start with that. The problem for China and the Belt and Road Initiative is a response to this is not that it could blockade people out of the South China Sea, where you're only basically going to China. It's that the rest of the world could blockade China in the South China Sea and cut off its supplies, particularly of hydrocarbons and other vital raw materials. It's called the Singapore strategy because of the importance of the Straits of Malacca, or the Malacca strategy. And what we're seeing in the South China Sea and even further south into the coastal waters of the Philippines is China trying to build up a chain of naval bases to push that blockade as far away from the Chinese coast as possible. Because if you can blockade somebody at that distance, you're also within missile range of most of their major economic centers with conventional ordnance. So I think it's far more likely that China might think about invading Taiwan and the West would think about blockading China into the South China Sea as a countermeasure. So I think there isn't a China blockading itself in. No. It does need to communicate. It couldn't care less about British woolen goods and manufactured output. It is now part of the global economy. So as I see it, it will be China trying to prevent that blockade, and it's enormous and I think almost certainly a futile railway project is a demonstration of just how seriously it takes that prospect.
Right. Well, that's interesting. So can I just ask then myself, I mean, the fact that China is now sort of investing, lending, doing quite a lot of things in various countries and getting them hooked onto their trade route, if you want to call it that, but also having greater influence in terms of what they produce, whether you look at Africa and you look at sort of mining, you look at gold, you look at oil. Is that, in your view, both David and Andrew, the way that they are going to be moving to increase their own and also safeguard, if you like, some of the problems they may have on the trade front by other routes they're developing and dependency, if you want to call it that, that there now is between some countries and China, particularly as the US and others sort of withdraw a little bit in terms of their support, both on developing aid and elsewhere. Is that something that is part, you think, of what we learned from before empires do, and what China may be doing in the future to insulate itself up to a point, if you like, from any other attacks that may be against it?
Well, yeah, China is, I mean, to some extent, it's a concept. If you have a current account surplus, which China has had for many years, of very large scale, that means you invest abroad because you have to. It's just the other side of the balance of payments. But they have been trying to invest strategically. And
so till when does this...
Hello, yes, carry on.
Sorry, you went blank for a sudden. So, and they've been trying to secure, make sure they have supplies of minerals from Africa, and by investing there, or make sure that, I don't know, Trump says they've been trying to make sure they have access through the Panama Canal by buying ports at each end. They've undoubtedly been reasonably strategic in their investments. And over the last few years, they've been also gradually running down their holdings of US Treasury bills, which perhaps is, given the position they're in, is a wise thing for the Chinese to be doing.
Although, of course, what's happened because of the strikes in Iran and the concerns about the Middle East is suddenly the US is seeing a bit of an inflow again because it's considered to be more of a safe haven. So we are in a sort of very contradictory situation right now. But there has been a question about India. And are we focusing too much on China? I mean, again, you know, you've seen the routes that our Sir John Corbett has been taking. It's through the world, really.
Right.
So what about India? Should we be paying a lot more attention to it? I think I'm just trying to find it now in the chat, and maybe they want to come off the sort of mute bit and ask it. But anyway, that's what it is. I'll find in a minute which one.
I can ask it if
who
you
had
want.
asked it. Oh, great, Simon. Yes, please.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Good conversation. Yes, it's just I recently did visit India. I went there 40 years ago, first time, and it was just grades of poverty was all you saw. And I was struck by my visit this time at just how obvious the rapid economic growth is there and emergence of a real middle class. And this was in southern India, not even in the north, which is on the whole slightly richer. So I was just wondering, it's already just past the demographic marker of China. It's now the biggest population in the world, given the dynamic of its growth. Is it, I would say, having been there for several weeks, I'd be surprised if it's not equaling the US and the Chinese economy in about 25, 30 years' time. If it just keeps on its current trajectory, and it's, all through that period, it's just going to be getting stronger and stronger. The US is not obviously getting stronger and stronger. China has probably reached a plateau of its dynamic. It of course brings in the whole complication of its relationship with Pakistan as well as with China. So it just throws in an enormous, whatever into the kind of, we've been able to talk about USA and China, and that's a kind of that helps because it reduces things to these two players. But I do think that India, at the very least, I mean, you introduced the EU, but I think India is also not quite such an obvious player as the EU at the moment. But I reckon it's going to be very soon, even if it isn't already.
Okay, well, before they come in, there is the issue, of course, that we have the BRICS, and of course India is part of that. The countries that were identified as being the nations for the future, which of course includes India and China. And the interesting thing is that they are extending their membership, and they're also looking at developing trade in a way that allows them also to bypass the American and the US dollar system and the SWIFT system, and maybe use even digital tokens to do their trade. So there is this polarization taking place, and India is very important. But of course, India is looking. The interesting thing about it is looking both to the west and to the east, and possibly a little bit to the north. So it's a major player in this, and a major player, I would say, in allowing the establishment of we may have, but India is right at the center of this. So I would think that it is a very important one to, of course, what we talk about today, but the trade is a very important one for them as well. Seriously important, because they do still rely on an awful lot of energy coming in from the outside, and what's going on today and the last couple of days must be a worrying factor for them as well. So anyway, I think it's a very good point, Simon, and I don't know whether either Andrew or David want to say something. Andrew, yes.
Happy to start. China has a ring of naval bases around India, in Myanmar, in Pakistan, and in Sri Lanka. It also has obviously one in Somalia as well. China and India have major war in the 1960s, and they've certainly had serious border clashes involving loss of life up in the Himalayas. And they're building a canal to turn up to get them from ships from China through to the Indian Ocean through Pakistan. So I think that's a conflict that may develop in the future. India's economic development, I think, is highly significant. Thinking about how long countries in Africa are going to be prepared to put up with China running their assets, stripping their rare earth and etc., etc. Most of these countries put up with this anymore, and they will either nationalize or in some other way take back control. Because one of the problems with Chinese enterprise in countries, Africa is an obvious example, but there are many others, is they tend to leave behind a very large population of imported Chinese workers. And the Chinese view of people of Chinese ethnicity is not the same as we might take. If you are ethnically Chinese, but you live outside China, you don't count in the same way as an ethnic Chinese person inside China. And the Chinese government, historically, going back hundreds of years, was far less worried about Chinese people abroad than it was about its interests at home. So I think there are different patterns of action here. I think India takes a much more serious interest in people of Indian heritage and origin operating abroad. And of course, the one great advantage we have is that India does play cricket, and that is a very significant cultural meeting point, because it's something that whole populations understand. Most people don't think about great power politics, but quite a lot of them would like to know what the cricket score is. And therefore, we are more familiar with India for historical and other reasons. And you can't take those kinds of sentiments out of your calculations, because otherwise you will miss the nuances that make a difference. But over to you, David.
Well, India also has English as one of their official languages, not American, but English. Yeah. I wonder whether, just thinking about it, we've been putting this discussion in terms of two superpowers, China and United States. But actually, the world of the future is probably going to be multipolar rather than bipolar. And as was pointed out, India's population is now larger than Chinese. I remember back in 1998, when the British were chairing what at the time was the G8, because Russia was a member. Suggesting that why didn't we expand it to become the G10 or G11 and have India, China, maybe South Africa as members as well. Well, today, actually, the G20 is probably economically much more important than the G7. And we're moving towards that sort of world. So I'm reflecting on the earlier parts of the conversation in terms of these two superpowers. Actually, I think the world is probably moving towards being more and not with Europe. All the African countries will come together. They're certainly a very populous continent, and certainly parts of Africa are economically growing quite fast. And Latin America, it's not a world just of two powers. That was the point that was brought home to me by somebody raising the question of India.
No, absolutely. Now we are getting near the end. I did want to ask a quick question, but I think Ewan Grant isn't with us. But the question was, particularly for David, do you believe that that the British institutions, that we are capable of identifying national security risks from China? I mean, you worked for a long period in government. Also, Andrew may have a view. And I think the question was, if so, what indicators would you use to identify such limitations? In other words, can we are we capable of, or are we constantly surprised? Cybersecurity, cyber attacks, ransomware, coming a lot of it from China, it seems, but also from elsewhere. I mean, are we on top of things at all? To even have the type of discussion to say, which way should we move, so or not? So perhaps David and Andrew can answer that, and then I'll move over to Ben, who has now appeared with an indication, basically, that we're near the end of this, what I find a very interesting discussion. So, David, do you want to say something quickly, like one minute?
We have very competent security services who have an exceptionally strong relationship with the United States, and exchange information. Whether they are totally up to the latest cyber issues, I don't know, but GCHQ is probably a world leader in that. So yes, in terms of identifying security risks, I think our institutions are as good as you could hope to have. Certainly were when I was having dealings with them, but I believe it's still the case.
Well, that's interesting, because one of the questions from Robin Stafford was, we're identifying maybe the security ones, but do we actually realize how developed China has become in terms of technology, and how it's modernized both its infrastructure and everything else, and therefore it's much more of a, if you want to call it a threat, than perhaps we had assumed just a little while ago. But anyway, that's the question, and that I think is something that we need to bear in mind for the future. And Andrew, do you want to just have some closing remarks on that?
I think the big question that we face looking at China from Britain is one of scale. If we don't have those strategic partnerships, the AUKUS submarine project is just one example of that. If we don't have good relations with Japan, for example, other countries, Britain will not be able to deal with this problem alone. We have to operate with partners.
Yeah.
We have to make our minds up ultimately whether we think China is going to move in a more positive and engaging direction in a multipolar world order of the future, or whether it is as hostile as some of its critics in America would argue, and that this is a permanent state. I tend not to think that permanent states are not permanent, and that things change. So we need to be acutely aware that we are facing serious threats of this nature. And as David stressed, not just from China, there are many other malign actors, quite a lot of them criminals, and some states who fund their activities through criminality. But that's a very old story. Robber barons were not invented in the 21st century. They go back to the dawn of time.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be aware it's a very bad world out there. Bad people do bad things, and holding the moral high ground is not necessarily going to give you any advantages. So
thank you. That's very interesting. Sorry.
Just be careful.
Yeah, but I mean, what is worth though taking from what you said earlier, Andrew, is that it is economics at the end of the day. The Chinese do want open trade, and the question is, as Mike Cook has put in the chat as well, and we need to make sure that our policies take that into account. Great. Well, thank you very much. That was really brilliant from both of you, and for those who've contributed as well. So, Ben, over to you.
So thank you so much, Vicky. I mean, first for Andrew, England are 350 to win tomorrow. So you're now up to date on the cricket squad. Secondly, loads of. I mean, I've just particularly that webinars. Our next webinar is with the second, I guess possibly arguably the third most famous Greek economist, Alex Andreou, and he will be speaking on the 17th of July, Greek Tragedy or Fast, What Next from Our Political Leaders. And I think he will be talking very specifically about the lessons that we can learn from Greek myths, but in terms of understanding what's happening next. And I have to say, having been following BBC News live throughout the day, yes, I'm not certain whether we're having tragedy or farce. So that will be a very good discussion. If you've enjoyed tonight, as I always say, you can make a donation. We don't charge for any of our sessions. We have the price of at least nobody out the new website. You can get it through the old link, but it's radixbigtent.org.uk. We've changed the name, but the old link will take you there. So please do support us if you've found tonight interesting. More importantly, support David. You can pick up a copy of his book. You'll have seen details of that posted in the chat. And thank you so much again to our speakers, to our guests for joining us. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Thank you. And I will say good night. By all means, turn your videos on if you wish to wave and say goodbye.